Climate scientists have studied the effects of carbon emissions on climate change for many years, although these studies became more serious in the 1950s. In 1958, a scientist by the name of Charles David Keeling went to the Mauna Loa Observatory and took air samples and collected carbon samples from the air. From this data, he was able to from this data, he collected yearly samples of carbon, and from this data, he was able to chart carbon emissions over the next 10 years. And in 1970, by 1970, he was able to conclude that carbon emissions were rapidly increasing over the span of time, and that it was an increasing issue in the United States. From this data, even into modern day, we still use this model, which is wildly impressive considering that Keeling was collecting this data during a Cold War era, and that we typically think of science as rapidly improving. However, this has been accurate enough to withhold this test of time. From this model, what we have observed is that policymakers have actually changed their policy towards climate change, and over time, what policymakers have changed their policies, starting in the 1970s from when he was first able to observe these changes. In the 1970s, President Nixon was the first one to kind of start this movement towards sustainable energy with the Federal Energy Administration. In 1970, what he was able to do, he created the Federal Energy Administration, and he also started Project Independence. Project Independence was a movement to get the United States off of foreign oil. And this movement was further moved by President Carter, who was the first to provide alternative energy subsidies for companies that were advancing technologies of alternative energy. In the 2000 presidential election, the Democratic nominee Al Gore brought even more attention to this issue by stating the urgency for change on climate action. And now in modern context, what we see all these terms thrown around, like the 1.5 degrees Celsius barrier for preventing irreversible climate change, and we see this figure of net zero carbon, and we see figures like 4 degrees Celsius. Now, what does all this mean in the context of the Keeling curve? So what he means is, right here we can see from the 1958 to all the way up until modern day, that these carbon emissions are rapidly increasing. But even in the future, these projections of fossil fuel emissions and carbon emissions through 2100 are projected to increase. And if we go about business as usual, research from the University of California in San Diego show that if we go about business as usual, by 2100, we could see climate change, we could see global warming of up to 4 degrees. Now, what impacts does 4 degrees have? Well, first of all, biodiversity can be severely impacted, as well as human health, and impacts like changes in weather patterns and decreases in food yields, like crops like rice and corn. So this can have severe effects. Now, originally the idea was that we need to get under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would mostly prevent the damages of irreversible climate change. However, because of the Keeling model and projections through 2100, what climate scientists are now saying is that the most reasonable model would be to try to get under 2 degrees Celsius. And 2 degrees Celsius would mitigate the effects of the most severe climate change, while still giving us some leeway in order that we would not have to cut completely to net zero carbon by 2050. Net zero carbon by 2050 would allow us to get to to keep us below the 1.5 degrees Celsius barrier. However, not enough action has been taken to this point for some climate scientists to believe this is reasonable. So to conclude, from the Keeling curve, we know that carbon emissions are rapidly increasing, and that this is affecting climate change in many ways. And we know that the time to take action is now. The question is do we have enough time, and do we have the resources that we are able to do this from all the evidence, overwhelming evidence that we have?